The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the small town of Redstone. The wooden buildings lined up unevenly along the dusty main street looked as if they had been there for 100 years, weathered by wind and rain and sun. The town square was quiet except for the occasional clatter of horse hooves and the soft murmur of townsfolk gathered around the central post. At that post, standing under the relentless sun, was Clara. Her hands were tied tightly above her head, the ropes biting into her skin, and her heart raced faster with every passing second. She felt the heat pressing down not only from the sun but from the weight of every pair of eyes in the square. Clara's face burned with a mixture of shame and fear. She wanted to hide, to disappear into the dusty street, but she was trapped, both physically and by the judgment of the town, the whispers of neighbors, the pointed fingers of children, and the quiet, stern looks of the elders. All of it pressed down on her. She knew she had made mistakes, but they weren't as severe as everyone imagined. And yet, here she was, tied to a post for all to see, as if the world had decided that she alone had to carry the burden of public shame. She struggled against the ropes again, trying not to cry. "Please, someone, let me go," she whispered, her voice almost swallowed by the murmurs around her. Her knees weakened as she tried to stand taller, wanting to appear brave, but inside she felt smaller than ever. Every step she had taken that led her to this moment replayed in her mind. Each choice, each small misstep now felt like it had led to an enormous punishment. Clara's thoughts raced. How did it come to this? How could the town be so harsh? The townsfolk, however, seemed almost mesmerized by the spectacle. Some were young and curious, their eyes wide as they whispered to one another. Others were older, nodding with grim satisfaction, convinced that the punishment was necessary to maintain order. Clara could see a few faces that she recognized, neighbors, shopkeepers, people she had laughed and shared meals with. Yet now they seemed different. Their smiles were gone, replaced by cold looks and judgmental stares. Even the children, usually innocent and full of life, seemed to have learned the harshness of the world too early. Clara felt the ropes again, tightening slightly with her struggle. They were rough, frayed by time and use, scratching her wrists and making small, angry red marks. She flinched at the pain, but more than the physical discomfort, it was the feeling of helplessness that crushed her. For hours, maybe it had been hours, time seemed strange under the hot sun. She had stood there feeling the weight of every eye upon her. Her throat was dry, her lips parched, and her mind searched desperately for any way to escape the shame. She tried to focus on anything but the humiliation. She thought of her family, long gone from Redstone, who would never know of her suffering here. She thought of the little garden she had tended at the edge of town, imagining the soft green leaves and bright flowers, and it gave her a flicker of comfort. Yet as soon as she closed her eyes for even a moment, the voices of the townsfolk filled her ears again, reminding her of her predicament. A few people had started to gather closer now, as if the passing hours had emboldened them. One man, older than the rest, leaned on his cane and shook his head slowly. "She brought this upon herself," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. A few nodded in agreement, their expressions grim. Clara wanted to shout back to tell them it wasn't entirely her fault, but her voice felt trapped behind the dryness of her throat. She realized that no amount of explanation would matter here. The story had already been written by the judgment of the crowd. Clara's thoughts turned inward again. She thought of the small joys she had once known, reading by the firelight at her home, the quiet walks through the nearby hills, the laughter of friends before the town had turned its eyes toward her. Now all of that seemed distant, almost unreal. She could barely remember the sound of her own laughter, drowned out as it was by the mocking whispers and judgmental glares. Her stomach twisted with fear, and she felt the sting of tears she refused to shed. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter, barely offering any relief from the blazing heat. Clara's arms ached from being held above her head for so long. She could feel the blood rushing to her hands and wrists, making them tingle painfully. She had tried to shift her weight, to ease the pressure, but the ropes held her firmly, almost as if they were mocking her efforts. She closed her eyes briefly, hoping that when she opened them it would all be a bad dream. But when she opened them, nothing had changed. She was still there, tied to the post, exposed to the gaze of everyone who had once called her neighbor or friend. Then, a small sound reached her ears. It was faint at first, like the soft jingle of horse hooves on the hard-packed dirt of the square. She turned her head slightly, straining against the ropes, trying to see. A figure was approaching from the edge of town. At first she couldn't make out much, just a shadow in the bright sunlight. But as the figure came closer, she noticed the wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face and the long coat that moved with the rhythm of his horse. The murmurs of the crowd quieted slightly, as if they too were noticing the newcomer. The cowboy dismounted smoothly, his movements calm and deliberate. He tied his horse loosely to a nearby post and walked toward her. Clara's heart raced, a mixture of hope and fear twisting in her chest. Who was he? Why was he here? Would he simply watch like everyone else? Or could he possibly be here to help her? He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, his eyes calm and steady. Clara tried to read his expression, but it was difficult beneath the shadow of his hat. There was no mockery there, no judgment, just a quiet, steady gaze that seemed to measure the unfairness of the situation. The townsfolk watched him warily, some whispering to each other, unsure of what to make of the stranger who dared approach the scene. Clara's lips moved slightly as she whispered, almost desperately, "Please, someone, help me." Her voice was tiny, but the sincerity in it seemed to reach him. The cowboy nodded slowly as if acknowledging her plea. He reached for the ropes with careful hands, and Clara felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For the first time that day, there was a hint of hope. The ropes were rough under his fingers, but he worked patiently, undoing the knots with skill and care. Clara held her breath, feeling each loop loosen, each knot give way. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd rise again, some in shock, some in anger, but she tried not to pay attention. All that mattered was that someone had seen her not as a sinner, not as a spectacle, but as a human being in need of help. As the last rope fell away, Clara rubbed her wrists, feeling the blood return to them. She stumbled slightly, weak from standing so long, and the cowboy caught her lightly, steadying her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the town. The cowboy didn't answer immediately. He simply nodded and gave her a small, reassuring smile. His presence seemed to calm her, to give her a sense of strength she hadn't felt in hours. For the first time that day, she felt the heavy weight of humiliation lift just a little. She still had to face the town, still had to explain herself, but for now, she had a small victory. She was no longer tied, no longer trapped in the square. And as she stood there, catching her breath, she realized that perhaps the world wasn't entirely cruel. Perhaps sometimes kindness came from unexpected places, even from a lone cowboy who rode into a dusty square at the hottest hour of the day. Clara's heart was still racing as the cowboy helped her step away from the post. The ropes had left angry red marks on her wrists, and the heat of the sun pressed down mercilessly on her back. For a moment she simply stood there, letting her body relax slightly as the weight of the ropes lifted. But even with the immediate danger gone, she felt a nervous tension. The townsfolk were still there, watching her with curiosity, suspicion, and, in some faces, lingering judgment. The cowboy stood beside her, silent and steady, as if he had always belonged there. Clara noticed the dust on his boots, the worn leather of his coat, and the calm way he carried himself. He didn't speak immediately, letting the quiet of the square stretch between them. Clara's chest rose and fell as she tried to catch her breath, and she realized that for the first time all day, she could actually feel the sun on her skin without it burning her in shame. Slowly, her eyes began to take in the scene again. The town square, which had seemed overwhelming before, now appeared smaller, almost ordinary. The buildings were old, with peeling paint and sagging wooden roofs, and the central post where she had been tied looked like nothing more than a weathered piece of wood. Yet the eyes of the townsfolk were still upon her, and she knew she had to face them. Some of the onlookers were whispering to each other, casting quick glances at the cowboy. There was a strange tension in the air, as if the presence of this stranger had changed something invisible in the town. People who had been angry moments ago now seemed unsure of themselves. Even the old man with the cane, who had muttered about justice, looked hesitant. The crowd was waiting to see what would happen next, and Clara realized she was caught in the middle of more than just her own story. She was caught in a silent test of the town's conscience. The cowboy finally spoke, his voice calm and even, carrying clearly across the square. "Why is she tied here?" he asked, addressing the crowd rather than Clara. His question was simple, yet it seemed to cut through the tension like a fresh breeze. The townsfolk looked at each other, some avoiding eye contact, unsure how to respond. The words hung in the air, and for a moment the only sound was the quiet flapping of a loose sign in the breeze. Clara felt her heart lift a little. Someone had finally asked the right question. Someone who didn't immediately assume she was guilty or deserving of punishment. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. The heat, the fear, and the embarrassment of standing in front of the entire town made it difficult to find the words. Yet the cowboy didn't rush her. He simply waited, his gaze steady and encouraging. Finally, Clara took a deep breath. "They think I made a mistake," she began, her voice soft but clear. "Something happened that wasn't entirely my fault, and they decided to punish me in front of everyone." She looked around the square, meeting the eyes of some of the townsfolk. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I tried to fix it, I really did." The cowboy nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without interruption. There was a quiet respect in the way he listened, a patience that gave Clara the courage to continue. "I've always tried to do the right thing," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But sometimes things go wrong even when you try your best. I didn't deserve this." Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Clara noticed that a few people had lowered their heads. It seemed her words were reaching them, touching something in their conscience that had been buried under habit and judgment. For the first time, she felt the possibility that someone might understand her, even if just a little. The cowboy spoke again, this time directly to the townsfolk. "Do we punish people for mistakes, or do we help them learn from them?" His question was gentle but firm, and it made several people in the crowd frown thoughtfully. The town had always been strict, holding its own rules above compassion, and his words were like a mirror held up to their faces. Some of the younger people in the crowd whispered among themselves, looking at Clara with a hint of sympathy for the first time. Clara glanced at the cowboy, gratitude shining in her eyes. She didn't know who he was or why he had come to help her, but she felt a strange sense of safety with him nearby. There was strength in his calmness, and it made her believe for the first time that day that she might survive this ordeal without losing her dignity entirely. The old man with the cane finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. Maybe we overreacted," he said slowly. Others nodded, some reluctantly, some more openly. A few people muttered apologies, not directly to Clara, but in acknowledgement of their own hasty judgment. The tension in the square began to ease, and Clara could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze becoming lighter, less sharp. Even with the crowd softening, Clara knew she still had to regain her own strength. She took a small step forward, then another, feeling the ground beneath her feet instead of the hot, rough ropes that had bound her. Each step was a small act of reclaiming her freedom, of reminding herself that she was not powerless. The cowboy stayed close, walking beside her without saying a word, letting her move at her own pace. She noticed children peeking out from behind their parents, their wide eyes full of curiosity and wonder. They whispered to one another, pointing occasionally but without the cruelty she had seen before. Clara managed a small, shy smile in their direction, feeling a flicker of hope. Perhaps the lesson of this day would reach even the youngest hearts in Redstone. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the heat became more intense, but Clara didn't feel it the same way she had before. She was moving now, moving with purpose and support. She began to notice details in the town she had overlooked before. The way the wind rustled the wooden signs, the faint smell of bread from the bakery, the soft cooing of pigeons perched on the rooftops. These small details reminded her that life continued, even after shame, and that there was beauty in ordinary moments. As the day wore on, the cowboy finally spoke to her, his voice calm and gentle. "You are stronger than you think," he said. Clara looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his words. I'm not sure," she admitted softly. "I've never felt strong today." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Strength isn't always about standing alone. Sometimes it's about accepting help and then standing again. You've done that today. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that settled into Clara's heart. She felt a warmth that wasn't from the sun, but from the kindness and recognition of someone who truly saw her. The townsfolk were beginning to disperse, some with lingering looks of guilt, some with cautious relief. The square felt quieter now, less like a place of judgment and more like a place where change was possible. Clara realized that while the ropes had been removed, the real challenge lay ahead, restoring trust, reclaiming respect, and proving that one mistake did not define her entire life. She looked at the cowboy again, ready to speak, but he shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said softly. "Take your time. Let them see the real you in your own way." Clara nodded, understanding that his advice was as much for her heart as it was for the town. She felt a new determination rising inside her, a spark that refused to be extinguished by shame or judgment. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara breathed deeply, feeling the air in her lungs and the sun on her skin without the crushing weight of fear. She realized that the day had changed her, not just because of the public humiliation, but because someone had chosen to see her differently, had chosen to stand beside her when no one else would. And as the cowboy prepared to leave, his horse tied and waiting, Clara felt a quiet gratitude. She didn't know his name, and she might never see him again, but his presence had reminded her of something crucial. Even in the harshest moments, kindness and courage could appear, often when least expected. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time that day she believed that she could face it. The cowboy tipped his hat, gave a small nod, and walked back to his horse. Clara watched him mount and ride away, his figure shrinking against the bright horizon. She felt a strange mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness because he was leaving, hope because his actions had shown her a different way forward. The townsfolk were slowly dispersing, their whispers fading, and the square felt less like a place of punishment and more like a place of possibility. Clara stood alone for a moment, feeling the empty space around her, and then she began to walk. Each step was firm, each breath steady, and with every movement she reclaimed a piece of herself. The sun was still hot, the dust still clung to her shoes, but she no longer felt trapped. She had survived the shame of the square, and she had discovered something far more important: the courage to stand again, even in the face of judgment, and the hope that the world could still offer kindness even when least expected. Clara walked slowly through the dusty streets of Redstone, her steps careful yet purposeful. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings and making the town look different than it had at midday. What had felt like a prison before now seemed like a place she could navigate, one careful step at a time. Her wrists still tingled from where the ropes had rubbed, but she held her head high, determined not to let the marks define her. As she moved away from the square, she thought about the cowboy. Who was he? Why had he chosen to help her? He had appeared suddenly, like a shadow stepping into the light, and then he had left just as quickly, leaving her with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Clara tried to replay his calm, steady movements in her mind, the way he had untied her with patience and care, the way he had asked the townsfolk that simple but powerful question: why is she tied here? She could feel a sense of courage rising inside her because of him, a spark she hadn't felt before. The town was quieter now than it had been in the afternoon. Many people had returned to their homes, some still murmuring about what had happened in the square. A few lingered, watching Clara from doorways and windows, perhaps hoping to see what she would do next. She could feel their eyes on her, but instead of fear, she felt a strange determination. She would not hide. She would not run. Today she would face the consequences of her actions, yes, but she would do it with dignity and strength. As she walked, Clara remembered the small garden behind her family's old house. The garden had been her sanctuary, a place where she could think, breathe, and feel alive. She hadn't been able to visit it for weeks, not since the incident that had brought the town's harsh judgment upon her. But now, as she passed familiar streets and alleys, she realized she wanted to see it again, to reconnect with something real and alive in her life, something that reminded her that life could still be beautiful, even when people had been cruel. The path to the garden was quiet, lined with old wooden fences and the occasional flower that had survived the summer heat. Clara felt the soft wind on her face and breathed deeply, savoring the simple pleasure of moving freely, unbound. For the first time all day, she felt a sense of normalcy creeping back into her life. Even though the humiliation had been severe, she realized she was still herself, still capable of kindness, courage, and hope. When she reached the garden, Clara paused. The plants had grown wild in her absence, but there was still beauty here. Green leaves stretched toward the sun, and a few flowers bloomed despite the lack of care. She walked among them, brushing her fingers lightly over the stems, feeling the rough texture of the leaves and the delicate softness of petals. The garden was a small world of peace, a place untouched by the judgment and harshness of the town. Clara knelt down and tended a small patch of flowers, pulling weeds and adjusting the soil with care. Each movement helped her feel grounded, connected to something real and lasting. As she worked, Clara thought about the people in the town. She knew some would continue to judge her. Some might even speak harshly about her behind her back. But she also realized that she couldn't let their opinions define her. She had survived the square, faced public shame, and yet she was still standing. That was proof enough of her strength, proof enough that she could continue moving forward even if the road was difficult. Suddenly, she heard the soft sound of hooves on the dirt path leading to her garden. She looked up quickly and her heart leapt. It was the cowboy. He had returned. Clara had not expected to see him again so soon, and yet here he was, riding slowly toward her, his presence calm and reassuring. She could see the sunlight glinting off his hat and the dust rising gently from his boots as he dismounted. "Hello again," he said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been in the square. "I thought you might need some company." Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. I didn't expect to see you," she admitted. "But I'm glad you're here." She paused, unsure how to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in the square." The cowboy nodded, leaning slightly against the wooden fence. "And what did you think?" he asked. "I thought, maybe I've been too hard on myself," Clara said slowly. "I let fear and shame control me. I didn't see the possibility of moving forward. But you reminded me that even when people are cruel or unfair, we can still find strength in ourselves." The cowboy smiled faintly as if he had expected her to understand this. "Strength comes in many forms," he said. "Sometimes it's the quiet determination to keep going, even when the world seems against you. Sometimes it's accepting help when you need it, instead of pretending you can do everything alone." Clara looked down at the small flowers in her hands, and then back at him. "I feel stronger already," she said softly. "But I know the town might not see it the same way." He shook his head. "That doesn't matter. What matters is how you see yourself. If you can walk through the square tomorrow knowing who you are and what you stand for, the town will notice eventually. People respect courage even if they don't admit it right away." Clara felt warmth rise in her chest at his words. She had spent so long worrying about what others thought, allowing their judgment to shape her life. But now she realized that her worth was not defined by gossip or public shaming. Her worth was in her actions, her choices, and her determination to keep moving forward. For a while, the two of them worked quietly in the garden. Clara tended the flowers and the cowboy watched, occasionally offering advice about trimming or watering. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than pressure. Clara realized that sometimes strength could be quiet and steady, growing slowly like the plants she cared for. Eventually, Clara spoke again. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. "You didn't have to. You could have just watched like everyone else." The cowboy looked at her, his eyes calm and thoughtful. "Because I've been in your place," he said quietly. "I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly, to feel trapped and alone. I've learned that sometimes all it takes is one person to see you for who you really are, instead of what they think you've done." Clara felt a lump in her throat. His words carried a weight she could feel deep inside her. It was as if he had walked alongside her in her pain, even though they had only just met. She realized that his kindness was not simple pity. It was recognition, understanding, and a quiet insistence that she deserved more than shame. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the garden in warm shades of gold and orange. Clara looked around, taking in the colors, the smells, and the quiet sounds of the evening. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known all day, of feeling that the world was not entirely cruel, and that she could find moments of beauty even after hardship. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "It's not just about surviving the shame. It's about learning to stand again, and about finding people who remind you of what's right and good." The cowboy nodded. "Exactly. And sometimes those people appear when you least expect them." He paused, looking at her with a gentle seriousness. "But remember this, Clara. The courage to stand again comes from within. Others can help, but the real strength is yours." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from a deep, growing sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt that maybe she could face the town tomorrow with her head held high. She could reclaim her place in Redstone, not as a victim of judgment, but as someone who had survived and grown stronger because of it. The cowboy finally mounted his horse, dust rising gently as he swung into the saddle. Clara watched him, feeling gratitude and admiration. "Thank you," she called out, her voice steady and sincere. He tipped his hat with a small, kind smile. "Keep going, Clara, you've got more strength than you know." Then, with a final glance, he rode slowly down the path, disappearing into the golden evening light. Clara stayed in the garden a little longer, letting the calm of the evening wash over her. She looked at the flowers, the soil, and the soft glow of the setting sun, realizing that the garden, like her, had survived neglect, hardship, and doubt. But it was still alive, still growing. And so was she. When she finally walked back toward the town, Clara felt different, stronger, braver, determined. The square still awaited her, and the townsfolk would still have their opinions. But she knew that she had the courage to face them. Not alone, but with the memory of the cowboy's kindness and the knowledge that her own strength could carry her forward. The streets of Redstone were quiet in the evening light, the shadows long and soft. Clara walked with a steady step, her head high, ready to reclaim her place in the world. She'd been tied and shamed, yes, but she had also been untied, not just physically, but emotionally. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. And that, she realized, was a kind of victory that no rope could ever take away. The next morning, Clara woke to the soft light of dawn spilling into her small room. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the nearby hills and the whisper of birds beginning their songs. She sat on the edge of her bed, her wrists still tender from the ropes of the previous day, but she no longer felt the weight of fear pressing down on her chest. Instead, there was a quiet determination, a steady pulse of courage that had grown stronger overnight. She had spent the night thinking about the cowboy's words, the reminder that true strength came from within, and that while others could help, the courage to stand again had to belong to her. Clara had never felt more aware of herself, more certain that she could face the town and reclaim her dignity. She knew it would not be easy. The whispers and judgment would not vanish overnight, but she felt ready, more ready than she had in weeks, perhaps even months. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a simple but clean dress, one that reflected not just her modesty, but her pride in herself. She combed her hair neatly, tying it back with a ribbon, and looked at her reflection in the small mirror. She saw a face that had endured hardship, yes, but also a face that carried determination, a spark that could not be extinguished by shame. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "Today I stand. I will not hide." As she stepped out of her room and into the town streets, the early morning light painted the wooden buildings in warm shades of gold and brown. The town was quiet, save for the distant calls of merchants preparing their shops and the soft clatter of horseshoes on dirt paths. Clara's footsteps were firm and steady as she approached the square. It looked different in the morning light. Not as oppressive, not as filled with whispers and judgment, but still a place that had been a site of humiliation. Yet today she felt no fear. She felt the strength of her own resolve, the quiet courage that had grown in her heart. When she reached the square, a few townsfolk were already gathering. Their faces held curiosity and caution, some still carrying traces of judgment, others hints of uncertainty. Clara's chest rose and fell steadily. She could feel the tension in the air, but it no longer crushed her. She had survived shame, and she had learned that her value was not determined by others' opinions. Clara walked to the central post, the place where she had been tied, and paused. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, free and unbound, but the memory of the ropes lingered. She thought of the crowd's whispers, the pointed fingers, the judgment that had seemed so absolute the day before. Yet today she did not feel small. Today she felt a quiet power, the kind that comes from surviving hardship and choosing to rise above it. A few people stepped forward, uncertain. One woman, who had whispered harsh words the previous day, looked at Clara with an expression that mixed guilt and curiosity. Clara met her gaze calmly, without anger or resentment. She had learned that strength was not about confrontation, but about standing with dignity. "Good morning," she said simply, her voice clear and steady. I hope you are well today." The woman blinked, surprised by the politeness, and looked down for a moment before nodding. Others followed her example, and slowly the square began to feel less tense. Clara realized that her calm and confident demeanor was changing the atmosphere, softening the judgment and suspicion that had hung over the town like a heavy cloud. As she stood in the square, Clara's mind drifted briefly to the cowboy. She wondered if he was watching from afar, proud of the strength he had helped awaken in her. Though he was not there, his words and actions remained with her, guiding her steps and steadying her heart. She realized that while his presence had been important, the real power came from within. She was standing now on her own strength, ready to face whatever the town had to say. One of the town elders, a man with a kind but stern face, stepped forward. He had been part of the group that decided her punishment, and now he looked uncertain, almost hesitant. "Clara," he said slowly, I think we may have been too harsh." His voice was quiet, but it carried across the square. "We acted in anger and without full understanding. We did not see your side of the story." Clara listened carefully, feeling a mixture of relief and caution. She had hoped for recognition, but she knew it might not come easily. "Thank you for saying that," she replied calmly. "I understand that mistakes happen. I only ask that we try to understand each other and not let fear or judgment control us." The crowd shifted, and murmurs spread as more people began to speak. Some offered quiet apologies, others nodded in agreement. The atmosphere in the square changed gradually, as if her calm courage had begun to teach the town a lesson in humility and compassion. Clara realized that standing with dignity, without anger or resentment, was teaching the people around her more than shouting or pleading ever could. As the morning passed, Clara moved through the square, greeting neighbors and acknowledging those who had once judged her. Some looked at her with hesitation, but many began to smile, offering friendly words and gestures. She noticed that the town felt lighter, more open, as if the act of facing shame with courage had begun to heal old wounds and misunderstandings. Clara found herself thinking about the future. She wanted to rebuild trust, to reconnect with the people who had once been her friends and neighbors. She wanted to show them that one mistake did not define her life, and that growth, understanding, and forgiveness were possible. The square, once a place of fear and humiliation, had become a place of potential, a place where courage could inspire change. A small group of children approached her cautiously, holding flowers they had picked from the edges of the square. "For you," one of them said shyly, offering the blooms with wide eyes. Clara knelt down, accepting the flowers with a warm smile. "Thank you," she said gently. "These are beautiful. You are all very kind." She felt a rush of gratitude and hope. The town's youngest generation, at least, seemed ready to learn compassion from her example. Clara continued through the square, noticing small acts of kindness that had begun to emerge. A merchant offered her a basket of fresh bread, a neighbor invited her to help tend a garden, and even those who had been critical the day before spoke with cautious respect. Each gesture, no matter how small, reinforced her belief that people could change and that courage and dignity could inspire others to do the same. By midday, the square had transformed. It was still a place of public gathering, but it no longer carried the weight of judgment and shame. Clara had reclaimed it not through confrontation, but through her calm presence, her strength, and her willingness to face hardship without bitterness. She realized that true courage was not about punishing others for their mistakes, but about showing them the power of compassion, understanding, and resilience. Clara paused in the center of the square, looking around at the town she had once feared. She felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not in defeating others, but in standing for herself and showing that dignity and courage could prevail. The sun shone down warmly, casting light across the buildings and the people who had once judged her. And in that light, Clara felt hope, not just for herself, but for the town that had begun to learn what it meant to be kind and fair. As the day wore on, Clara knew that challenges would continue. There would still be those who doubted her, who whispered behind her back, who judged too quickly. But she had discovered something far more important: the strength to face them, the courage to stand tall, and the wisdom to show that dignity was earned not through punishment, but through resilience and compassion. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Clara had walked through the town square several times, each pass reinforcing her confidence and calm. She knew the memory of the ropes and the shame would remain with her, but they no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed herself and in doing so had begun to inspire change in the hearts of others. As evening approached, Clara finally paused near the central post once more. She placed her hand lightly on the wood, remembering the humiliation of the day before and the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. She smiled softly, feeling a sense of closure and triumph. She had faced the town, faced her fears, and reclaimed her dignity. And as she looked toward the horizon, she felt a sense of peace and purpose that would guide her in the days to come. The following morning, Redstone awoke to a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers from the hills beyond the town. Clara stood at the edge of her small home, gazing at the quiet streets. The sun was just beginning to climb, spreading warm light over the wooden buildings and casting soft shadows on the dirt roads. Today felt different. Clara could sense it in the air, the possibility of change, the promise of a fresh beginning. She had spent the night reflecting on the events of the past 2 days. The shame she had endured in the square, the ropes that had bound her, and the judgment of the townsfolk all weighed on her mind. But they no longer held the power they once did. She had faced fear and humiliation and had emerged stronger, more confident in herself. The quiet courage she had discovered within her heart now felt like a steady flame, ready to guide her through whatever challenges might come next. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant outfit, one that reflected her renewed sense of dignity. She braided her hair neatly, tying it with a ribbon she had found in a small drawer. Looking at her reflection, she felt a quiet pride. She was no longer the same person who had been tied and shamed in the square. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to reclaim her place in the town she had once feared. As she walked through the streets, Clara noticed the town had begun to stir with life. Merchants were setting up their stalls and children were running along the dirt roads, their laughter filling the air. Some townsfolk glanced at her as she passed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. Clara returned their gazes calmly, offering a polite nod or a gentle smile. She could feel the town beginning to see her differently, not as a figure of shame, but as someone who had faced adversity with grace and courage. Clara made her way to the town square once again, the place that had been the scene of her public humiliation. As she entered, she noticed that the atmosphere had changed. The square no longer felt heavy or oppressive. The morning light painted the wooden buildings in warm hues, and the soft sound of birdsong filled the air. Some townsfolk were already present, standing in small groups and speaking quietly among themselves. There was an air of anticipation, as if they were waiting to see what Clara would do next. She paused in the center of the square, taking a deep breath. The ropes were gone, but the memory of them lingered. She felt the rough texture of her wrists in her mind, but she no longer felt the fear or shame that had once consumed her. Instead, she felt a quiet strength, the kind that comes from surviving hardship and choosing to rise above it. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, ready to face the town fully without hesitation. A few people stepped forward, their expressions tentative. The woman who had whispered harsh words the day before approached Clara slowly. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. Clara looked at her calmly, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. "Thank you," she replied softly. "It means a lot to hear that. We all make mistakes, but we can choose to learn from them." Other townsfolk began to step closer, offering small gestures of kindness. A merchant handed her a basket of fresh fruit, a neighbor invited her to join a gathering later in the day, and a group of children approached with flowers, smiling shyly as they offered them to her. Clara accepted each gift with grace, her heart swelling with a sense of hope. The square, once a place of humiliation, was becoming a place of connection, understanding, and renewal. As Clara moved through the square, she thought about the cowboy. He had appeared when she needed help the most, and had shown her that strength could come from both within and from the kindness of others. Though he had left the previous evening, his presence lingered in her mind, a reminder of the importance of courage, empathy, and quiet determination. She wished she could thank him properly, but even without words, she knew his lesson had taken root in her heart. A soft sound of hooves echoed from the edge of the square, and Clara turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. The cowboy had returned. He rode slowly into the square, his hat tilted low, and dismounted gracefully. He walked toward Clara, his expression calm and reassuring. "Good morning, Clara," he said gently. "I thought you might like some company as you face the town today." Clara felt a smile spread across her face. "I'm glad you're here," she replied. "I've learned so much since you first untied me. Your words, your kindness, they gave me courage." The cowboy nodded, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "You had the courage all along," he said. "I only helped you see it. Now it's your turn to show the town who you really are." Clara took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the steady beat of her heart. She looked around at the townsfolk who were watching her with curiosity and anticipation. She realized that today was not just about her own journey. It was about showing them the power of dignity, resilience, and compassion. She could demonstrate that mistakes did not define a person, and that courage and understanding could transform even the harshest judgments. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady. "I know that yesterday many of you judged me harshly," she said, glancing around the square. "I understand why you were concerned, and I accept responsibility for my actions. But I ask you to remember this. One mistake does not define a person. We are all capable of learning, growing, and becoming better." The townsfolk listened quietly, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging thoughtful glances. Clara continued, her words flowing with sincerity and confidence. "We all have moments when we falter, when fear or misunderstanding leads us astray. But it is how we respond, how we choose to rise again, that truly matters. I have faced shame, I have faced fear, and I have chosen to stand. I hope that you will see me not as someone who has failed, but as someone who has learned and who continues to grow." A hush fell over the square as Clara spoke. The words were simple, yet they carried a powerful truth. She had transformed her fear and humiliation into a message of courage and hope, and the townsfolk could feel it. Slowly, one by one, people began to nod, acknowledging her strength and determination. The old man with the cane, who had once spoken harshly of her actions, stepped forward. His face was thoughtful, softened by reflection. "Clara," he said slowly, "you have shown us what courage truly means. You have faced our judgment and stood tall. We are proud to call you one of our own." Clara felt a surge of gratitude and relief. She had not sought approval or praise, but it was comforting to see that her courage and dignity had touched others. She smiled warmly at the old man and then turned to the crowd. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your understanding means more than words can express. Let us move forward together, with kindness, fairness, and respect for one another." The townsfolk began to disperse slowly, but there was a lightness in the air that had not been present the day before. Children ran and laughed, neighbors spoke with renewed warmth, and even those who had once been skeptical seemed to carry a sense of hope. Clara realized that by facing her shame and standing with courage, she had not only reclaimed her own dignity, but had also inspired a small but meaningful change in her community. The cowboy watched quietly from the edge of the square, a small smile playing on his lips. Clara noticed him and waved, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He tipped his hat in acknowledgement and gave a nod, silently conveying pride and encouragement. Then without a word he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Clara to continue her day with the knowledge that she had grown stronger and that the town had learned an important lesson in compassion. Clara returned to her home later in the day. Carrying a basket of fresh flowers and fruit gifted by neighbors, she placed them carefully on a small table by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the petals. She felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that had been missing for so long. The square, the town, and even the memory of her shame had become part of a journey that had strengthened her, shaped her, and given her the courage to embrace the future. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting Redstone in shades of gold and pink, Clara sat quietly on her porch reflecting on all that had happened. She realized that life would continue to present challenges, that there would be moments of fear and doubt. But she had learned the most important lesson. Strength comes from facing hardship with dignity, courage, and an open heart. She had faced judgment, humiliation, and fear, and she had risen above it all. The town had seen her strength, the children had seen her courage, and she had discovered it within herself. Clara smiled, feeling a quiet joy that filled every corner of her being. She knew that her journey was only beginning, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The ropes that had once bound her were gone, replaced by the unbreakable strength of her spirit. And as the evening settled over Redstone, Clara felt a profound sense of hope. The town had learned compassion, she had reclaimed her dignity, and the future stretched out before her, bright and full of possibilities. She had survived shame, found her courage, and discovered that even in the darkest moments, kindness, strength, and resilience could guide the way.